Well, here's you guys. Dr. Mike Sevilla and Dr. Brad Roth, distinguished professor of physical chemistry, Mike Sevilla, and Department of Physics, Brad Roth. I met you at that Yes Expo, and he was getting little kids all excited about physics. So we have people who are able to handle many levels of academic ability here. As you probably, most of you know, I'm a doctoral candidate here in the computer science department. So I'm looking for people to collaborate with on information security projects. So if you get any brilliant ideas, yeah. Now for the main event, let's go ahead and just do some ground rules here. We're going to go through some questions. Each one's going to be preceded by a little cartoon like Dr. Smith did last time. I thought that worked kind of nice. And then after they make their comments about the question, ask whatever you want. And we'll try to keep it to 5 minutes per question. So that will be 50 minutes total. If you want some coffee or anything, I mean, should we do that first, you think? I don't know. Let's let this thing go. We waited long enough. So they'll comment, and then you guys can ask questions, and then we'll just have a free-for-all at the end for however long we can stay. So camera on these guys. Way to be proud. Struggling scientists, please cite my papers. That starts us off. Why would anyone want to write an academic paper?
Okay. Why would you write an academic paper? Well, if you're seeking a career in academia, this is sort of the route to success, because your academic papers are your credentials in the field. They are how you make your mark as a scientist or an engineer or in academia. So your publications and the quality of the publications and where they're published, we'll talk more about where, are how you get promoted in a research-oriented institution. So they're critical to your career and your choice of how you, where you publish, and your skills and developing ideas and so on are very critical to your career.
And if you do some fantastic, groundbreaking research and you don't tell anybody, it's like it never happened. So if you're the way scientists communicate with each other is primarily by publishing papers. They also go to meetings and they talk, but I think more the archive, the standard way to communicate your ideas is to publish. So it's a way, not only does it benefit you, but it's essential for science. Otherwise, science isn't going to progress.
Is it possible to get a PhD without publishing any academic papers?
That depends on your institution. There are some institutions that require 3 publications. UCLA in chemistry, that's a requirement. So that depends on the academic area and what the requirements are. Generally, if you haven't published an academic paper, that is a mark against you, and I don't know.
I agree. I lead the medical physics program, and we've had some cases where people have gotten their degrees without publishing any papers, but it usually means that wasn't a real successful case. We still gave them the degree, but it's not going to be good for them, and it's not good for us. It's an expectation. It's not a requirement, at least not in our program, but it is definitely a goal and an expectation. Questions?
It's pretty straightforward. Let's try a little. Let's get into the nitty-gritty here. Most scientists regarded the new streamlined peer review process as quite an improvement. The last guy looks pretty nasty. Here, I got
That's a rejection.
that is an unpleasant way to get rejected. What is peer review?
Well, when you send a paper in to get published, the editor of the journal will typically send it to 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 1, but 2 is kind of typical people who are experts in the field to read it, make comments, and recommend whether it should be published or not. And you basically have to go through this in order to have your paper accepted. If the reviewers are very negative, the editor will very rarely overrule them. So peer review is a way of quality control in the sciences, and oftentimes when you're talking about your publications, you'll say, I was published in a peer-reviewed journal, and that means a lot more than saying you were published in some journal that just states anything.
Right. And the peers that are reviewing the journal are your paper are people like you who have published in that journal, and it's a requirement, essentially, that if you're publishing, you will also be reviewing. And so the peer reviewers are not just those people. They're really, you're part of a scientific group that is reviewing each other's work. And so as you peer review, you learn about other people's work, but it's a requirement you not use that in your research until it's published. If you do, that's an ethical violation. There are all sorts of ways of having ethical violations in these processes, plagiarism and all sorts of things. So part of publication is to know the rules about the ethical requirements for each step in the process.
Usually the peer reviewers for most journals are anonymous. So you might be able to guess who they are, but you don't really know who they are. Most journals give the paper with your name on it. They don't try to hide who the author is. So usually the reviewer knows who you are, but you don't know who the reviewers are. There are exceptions, but I'd say 90% are that way.
Yeah, it's nearly always.
Yeah.
How many of you guys have peer reviewed as a reviewer? A couple of people.
I've done a lot of peer reviewing, and it's a lot of work, and you don't get paid for it. But it's really a service that the scientists have to do. Otherwise, you might have more time, but the entire science infrastructure is going to fall apart if people aren't willing to do the peer review.
And journal editors are now finding more problems in getting reviewers for their papers, depending on the journal and so on. So there is a lot of time-consuming effort that goes into reviewing a paper. So it's an ethical obligation that if you publish, you have to review. There's nobody who's going to put handcuffs on you and lead you away, but it's something that a lot of science is done as a community effort, and so your publications are how you make your career and make your mark in science, but also what goes underneath is a group effort. When you go to meetings, you tend to want to share your information with others to create an environment where everybody's working together. And at the same time, you know that you have to make your own advances. So there's a balance there that's tested.
And editors for a journal usually know the people in the field, and they're going to pick out a couple of the people in the world who are really experts in your field to review your paper. So you've got to assume you're being reviewed by some of the most knowledgeable people in the field. It's very hard to BS your way through because these are going to be truly your peers and the experts.
Right. Now you may find, and this happens occasionally, that the reviewer that is picked happens to be somebody that you have offended in some way, or has a very critical view of you and your research, and may not give an unbiased review. And if you've had that experience and you know who it is, or you think that you know who it is, you could actually request when you submit the article that this reviewer should not be chosen. Now, I've noticed that on some journal, I just submitted a paper and it said, please list those you would like to have review your paper who are expert in the area. and those that you do not wish to have. So there was actually, that's the first time I've seen that, so that is interesting.
Is it a good idea if you're referencing a paper, and the same guy is peer reviewing the paper, right? Or your paper, and you're referencing his paper in your paper. Is it a good idea to, and if you're trying to improve his idea, is that a good idea to ask for him to review the paper?
I think for your benefit long term, it's always best to have the most expert people in the area review it. Getting your paper through without having expert review may seem like I got my paper published, I've done that. But what happens is you may miss something, you may have made a mistake. And long term, making mistakes in the literature does more harm to you. So getting the paper rejected may be doing you a favor long term, because you can go back, correct that, and then send it in. So getting the most expert people you can get to review your paper makes the science more solid and makes your career advantaged.
Yeah, I sometimes get a little annoyed that when journals ask me for suggestions for reviewers, because it seems like the editor doesn't have that many jobs. That's the one that he should have, is to pick out the reviewer. So unless it's mandatory, I sometimes leave it blank. But I agree with your point. It's very useful to have a good review, even if it's painful.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Sorry, could you just choose the professor you had as the reviewer, or that's sort of not
Actually,
how they don't?
yeah, you can't have somebody from your own institution, and you can't, it's really considered unethical to have your former supervisor for the last few years, or a close collaborator.
Right.
So you really can't do that.
If you publish with somebody, they can't review your paper if it's a recent publication.
Yeah.
They have a number of years separation. So part of the requirements is that it be an objective, unbiased, and they're not going to favor you because they know you. That's
Other questions about peer review?
This is basically just a conference thing. It says, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? What is the difference between a journal and a conference?
Well, a journal is a written and published. It is a printed version, and a conference is where you go and present spoken words. Now, that isn't quite that simple, because at a conference you have abstracts that are published, and but generally you're speaking at a conference, or you're presenting a poster at a conference. A poster is a 4 by 8 feet sometimes, or 4 by 4. Some of you have already presented posters probably for scientific meetings or meetings you've been at, and they're a way of, it's an increasing way of scientists presenting their research where they don't speak, because speaking slots take so much time, and each one gives 15-20 minutes, and so if you go through a whole day of sitting there listening to 15 to 20 minute talks, you can get very blurry-eyed. So the poster came up as a way of people going through and looking at those that are of interest to them and speaking to a person in front of the poster. So you stand in front of your poster. So at a conference, that's basically what happens. You're either speaking or you're at a poster. And the journal is where you publish your papers.
Yeah, some people think posters sessions are sort of lower on the totem pole than a talk, but I find doing a poster is actually more useful. You get to talk with people, it's more fun.
Right.
But it is a little bit of interesting thing in that you publish an abstract, and sometimes a conference will have a conference proceedings, and you might actually publish like a page paper. Now usually that doesn't preclude you from publishing it in a full paper in a journal later. you can't really take the same data and publish it twice in a journal, but you can take stuff that you have presented at a conference and then publish the full version in a journal. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's highly recommended for the most part.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true, except for, go ahead.
Like, how long is it, like, the waiting time if you publish the paper and then you send it out for a conference? Because, I mean, if you send out a publication or a journal and you wanted to go to this conference, but it's the same data that you're using,
Usually the conferences, you present at a conference and you publish later, yeah. Or you publish them at about the same time. There's no rules or regulations. If you published and then presented at a conference, that's sort of, they're getting, the conference is supposed to be up to date, what's happening now, and if you've already published it last year and you're presenting it, they may have read it and said, what is he doing here?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not really unethical. It's just a little backwards
Right.
and somewhat counterproductive as far as your time is concerned.
In the computer science field, a lot of times the conferences are sought after things like MobiCom, things like this are hard, very exclusive. They are up to date because so many things in like smartphones and stuff are up to date.
Yeah. Some conferences are peer reviewed and only a small fraction of the abstracts get accepted. Some conferences are, most have some sort of peer review, but some will take 90% of the abstracts, and some will take 20%. It really depends on the conference. You just have to kind of know the field.
There are, if you're a member of societies, American Chemical Society, that I'm a member of, and a Radiation Research Society, you have a right to make a presentation, and the only requirement is that it's reviewed for, I would say that it isn't ridiculous, it doesn't have, it's not offensive, it is a scientific paper, and it fills that, then you can present it. That would be the weakest criteria,
Yeah.
because very few are thrown out in those societies. Being a member sort of gives you the right.
I know there's a conference in magnetic resonance imaging, I don't remember exactly which one, where they take only like 20% of the abstract. So there's also the other extreme, and where it becomes very competitive, and it's a really honor to get in. So you just have to know the field. Questions? I have a quiet audience. Feel free to.
You mentioned something about being a member.
Yes.
That might help someone to get or to see that sort of importance. For example, if I join the IEEE
Right.
and I send my paper to them,
Yeah.
and I am a member,
Right.
so maybe you cannot give me consideration first before the non-member paper, and then review it first because I am a member.
So I don't know about the IEEE, but in other societies that definitely would be the case, that members would be given preference. Now, it depends on how the body is set up to review those, but becoming a member in societies is usually, it has several levels. There are student memberships, and they very much encourage students to present posters, and some have student presentation sessions. So being a member at that level also allows you to get started early in your presentations.
I don't think that's true for publications. Like if you tried to publish a paper in IEEE Transactions of Biomedical Engineering, say, I don't think being a member gives you much, if any, advantage when it comes to peer review. So it's a little bit different between a paper and a conference. And speaking of memberships, one thing you should all be thinking about perhaps becoming members of is Sigma Xi. We have it's an honor society for all of sciences. We have a chapter right here at OU. It's a way you can get started, and it's really, I think it's a great society. So Yes.
That brings me to a question. I'm always floating on determining whether I'm in humanities or sciences.
Okay.
Linguistics, is that a science? Is that something that could be part of that?
Well, stigmatized is very broad. I usually think of linguistics as more humanities,
Yeah.
but that's not to say you couldn't become a member.
Okay.
It's a hard question.
Yeah. The other question I was going to ask was, you mentioned posters, and I haven't heard about those for conferences before. What's the situation with those? Is that
You mean how are they?
how are they put? What are they? Were they?
They are, physically, the way to make them is you get a PowerPoint slide, you put the dimensions as 4 feet by 4 feet or whatever the conference requires. And then you put the elements of a presentation on it, a title, the authors and affiliations, abstract, material,
As
methods.
if you were presenting it in a class or...
Right, exactly. And you put it all in nice columns with pictures and descriptive elements and conclusions. And then people come by and ask questions. Well, they don't have to read the whole thing there. They may just be interested in the title and look at your first figure and say, well, gee, that's very interesting. Could you explain that? And so, yeah.
There is a printer over in the print shop where you can get them printed up, but it costs a little bit. What, $100, $80?
Yeah, it's something
like that.
$100.
And I have occasionally kind of cheap, I'm a cheap guy, and printed them up and made them sort of in little pieces and tacked them up, and it looks a little tacky, I have to admit.
Now that actually they have a new way of printing them. Before they print them on really a sheet of paper that you had to roll up because of the glossy sheet, and if you folded it, it crinkled, and so it had to be rolled and put in a tube. And you'd go, if you've ever been on an airplane, you saw somebody stick this big 4-foot-long tube in there. They were going to a conference somewhere. Okay, now they have paper that is cloth-like paper. You can just fold it and put it in your bags and carry it with you. Nobody will know you're going to a conference. Yes.
What's more important in terms of publishing, quantity or quality? Is better to have too many okay papers or a few just superb, excellent papers?
Go ahead.
I would say probably quality, but you don't want to just totally ignore quantity. But I think if you have some just a handful of papers, but they're highly cited, they're really making an impact in the field, you're probably better off than having 100 so-so papers. So you don't want to just have one paper and have that, you know, modestly important, but ignore quantity. But I would say in the end, quality is going to win.
I would agree with that. Except in where people can't judge the quality of your work. So if you're at an institution which is counting them,
Yeah.
they will use metrics which are not really true metrics. They will use metrics such as the impact factor that we'll talk about later of the journal, and things of that sort have nothing really to do with the quality of your paper. And so they're mixed, but for your scientific reputation or your reputation in your field, having the quality paper is going to give you a lot better reputation than having lots of low quality papers. And
Or even mediocre quality. I mean, I don't mean like low quality, but mediocre quality.
If you're making progress and you're doing things that is sort of workman-like, but still people respect it, and you're doing a lot of that, that's going to get respect. There are people who are really brilliant people. They make Einstein, for example. I don't think he had that many publications, but everybody here knows his name and who he was because the publications he had were absolutely phenomenal. He broke a new world for us. So there are very few people who can do that. And so in science, most of us are more in the workman category. We're tinkering and we're breaking through the frontiers of science because you're working, when you're doing science or into this type of work where you're trying to break through into new knowledge, you really don't know what you're doing in some sense. And building that front outward is you're laying the foundation for others to come along. So that gets respected.
A little bit harder question is whether you should publish a long paper or several short ones, putting equality aside, because in some ways a long paper is nice, but if you spend 4 years and then get one long paper, you might be better off publishing 2 or 3 shorter ones. They're still good. Now some people try to go what's called the least publishable unit, where they break them up into 20 papers and each one has a tiny increment. I mean, that's not probably a good idea, but getting the length and versus quantity is a tougher decision. Getting quality, I think, is pretty clear. You want above quantity.
Right. I agree with that. I have a colleague who divided his work into each molecule. He would have another paper that he developed, and it became obvious that he was being lazy in a sense. And so he lost some credibility that way. But publishing a long paper is not a good thing in a number of ways today. Your audience has less of a retention. They're not going to read long papers by and large now. There are too many competing sources. So focusing your paper to showing an excellent point where you state what you're going to do, you state the problem first in the literature, and then you do something that is that you set a new piece of information out, a new way of understanding, and it's all collected in this one source as one publication. Gets you a lot of attention to that problem because the audience can understand it quickly, and if you have another discovery that you want to make, putting it in with that will just lose it. So if you have multiple things that you've discovered, sometimes it's best to present them separately so the ideas get out there into the arena instead of one getting lost.
What would you define as long or moderate length, roughly?
In the journal, it depends on the journal. Some journals that publish sort of communications and things, 4 pages would be typical length. If you start going up above 10 or 12 pages, I think you got yourself a long paper.
Right.
Double column?
No, this is in the journal.
Okay.
It's going to be longer than that when you submit the thing double spaced with all the figures and everything. But but in the journal, if it's going more than about 12 pages, you probably have yourself a pretty long paper.
Right.
It varies. It's just rule of thumb.
I know on the conferences, naturally this world is organized. For example, the department, the schools, everything ranked. And at conference, if somebody said, oh, there is a speaker from Harvard or Yale, you're going to expect somebody that's going to have very good topic. Or maybe a publisher also going to have the same content. My question is, does the school ranking, department ranking will affect my paper somehow, even though maybe good paper, but the department somehow, or the school ranking somehow, kind of as good as the other papers?
Well, actually, I think you'll find that yes and no. Good work will get published, okay, wherever it's from, because the peer reviewers generally know their business, and they will recognize it as good work, and it really doesn't matter where it came from. However, there's always an innate prejudice in some people about work from other institutions, and there is a pecking order that, as you just pointed out. So that can get in the mix, but in general, I'd say if you have good work, it's going to get published. And I think it might not get published in the top journal because the pecking order does work a little bit. I don't know if you
No,
think
I think So I think the same people who are doing the bean counting that you mentioned earlier are doing the pecking order.
Yeah.
The experts in the field are going to appreciate
Good
the
work.
good work. So probably short term, I think that can have an impact. But I think long term, it doesn't have too much of an impact.
I want to bring this question to a close because we have 10 questions and time is, this is a great topic. We could probably have more of these. But I think there is one question that's important enough to talk about before we leave the topic, which is the cost. I'm going to a conference first week of December. The fee's $960. And of course there's a plane flight and everything else. Now I published a journal paper earlier this year, nothing. One of the journals I was going to submit to said, "You please send us the voluntary optional fee, page fee, $100 per page." That's what they said. I'm not going to send you the fee. I don't have that kind of money. But the university, I mean, I managed to find some funding. They paid for my travel. That was cool. But it's a lot of money for a conference and a journal. But the journal's better, right? And it's free, right?
There's a reason to go to a conference different than a journal. At a conference, you meet people, you talk to them, you make your way within the field, you build your credibility with your peers as a person. And so and this is very critical if you're working toward getting funding, getting support from fund agencies, the National Science Foundation or other, could be the Department of Energy or whatever it is. Those people who you're talking to will also be reviewers on grants and publications and so on. And if you establish a credibility with them there, and they see who you are and they've talked to you and they see you're credible, that gives you a leg up in all of those cases. So it's actually, you probably can't be very successful if you don't go to conferences and present your work and make yourself known to the scientific world.
Especially when you're younger and
Yeah.
you're building a career. I probably don't travel as much as I should, and my career has probably been hurt marginally by that. But as far as cost of journal publication, it depends on the journal. Some of the open access journals will charge you a couple $1,000 to publish, and then anybody can access the paper. A lot of the other journals that require subscriptions, there's no page charges, and so it's gotten more confusing over the last few years because of that. I never pay the voluntary fees, to tell you the truth.
Well, nor do I.
There's so much to discuss on this topic, and I hate to leave it, but we got to press on.
Okay,
because,
let's move on.
This one says, has an attorney saying, "Then you struck the intruder with a bound PhD thesis?" And the defendant says, "Yes, it was research with impact." What is impact factor? You mentioned it already. What is impact factor?
Impact factor is just how many times a particular journal gets articles that it published cited by others, authors. So you just take the number of articles they've published and you take the number of citations those articles received in the subsequent years. You put A over B and you've got the impact factor. Say an impact factor of 5 would mean average 5 citations in a period of time after the publication. And so impact factors of 30 is for something like Science or Nature, and 30, 40 maybe. And then impact factors in 3 and 4 are good journals that are not magazines. They are just solid science journals. And then some 5 to not 10 are those who are trying to make, I would say, who are higher quality or higher visibility journals.
There's a lot of journals out there that might have an impact factor of 1 or 2. And what that means is that the typical paper in that journal only has 1 or 2 citations over the last 2 or 3 years, which is a little bit sad in a way.
Yeah.
But
And it's citations per paper
per
published.
paper, yeah, because they divide out by the number of papers. So you know, the typical paper only has a handful of citations. It's just the way it works out. You want to publish highly cited work. Yeah.
I think it also depends on the subject. Like in computer science, for example, you find a lot of top journals with one or less impact factor. So I think, and they are ranked very high as very high journals. You
Yeah.
agree, George?
No, it's probably more like 2.
Well,
Probably less than 1
but
is
not
not good.
5 or
That's
6.
not
Yeah.
That's not good. No, not 5 or 6.
Yeah.
It's pretty rare.
Okay.
Because there's so many different sub areas.
Right.
How many times?
Yeah,
can you
it
say?
does depend on the area. Very strong in chemistry, that's a little lower. And if you go to biology and some medical areas, you get much higher citations.
Science and nature are the two that I've never published in either one. I've always wanted to, and I feel kind of bad that I haven't broken into science or nature. But those are two really high impact journals that if you have something that's of wide interest, it would be a great place to try. And the good thing about science and nature is they'll usually tell you no very quickly. So you won't submit it and find out a no. You might submit it and find out a no 3 months later, but usually they'll tell you no within a week or two. So sometimes it's worth a try.
Yeah, the editor decides, yeah.
And does every,